Today we have Ken Reed on Heartbreak Surgery, and I've been wanting to talk to Ken publicly for a while here to get him on the podcast. I think there's a lot of interesting topics we can dig into. And for those of you that are not familiar with Ken Reed's work, Ken is a counselor in Sydney, Australia. And in addition to that, he is also in the attachment space as well. And he's been immensely helpful when it comes to kind of showing me some of the ropes with attachment theory and helping me out when I get stuck. And so he's provided some mentorship and some camaraderie along the way here. So Ken, welcome to the show.
Thank you. To be fair, I've mostly just annoyed Cody, but with all due respect, no, thank you very much for that introduction. Yes, I'm all those things. And I've mostly focused on talking about the impacts of what happens when someone's gone through what's called the avoidant discard. So that's essentially where someone has been dating an individual who has, at the very least, an avoidant attachment style, who is engaging in behavior where they make the person feel like their soulmate and then abruptly end things out of the blue, not because they don't necessarily love the partner or they won't into them. It's usually because there's a greater fear of intimacy, amongst other things as well too. And I've really just done the best I can to try and demystify a lot of this harmful behavior that occurs quite a lot in dating.
That makes sense to me. Yep, I'm very familiar with the avoidant discard and the ramifications of it. I've coached a lot of clients through that process as well, and it's very painful. I don't recommend it personally.
No, I generally don't recommend it to people, but at the same time, it is sort of like a trial by fire. I think that, there's always life before and after these experiences. And I almost think that in its own weird way, people kind of have to go through this because, it's sort of like a maturity in dating. You kind of have to go through the crap to realize, oh, this exists and I need to actually focus on my well-being. Some people may be very lucky and they get with their partner and they, have a soulmate who they knew from a very young age, if you believe in the concept of soulmates. But I think that for for a lot of us in the trenches, it's something which I think is deeply traumatic. And I think that a lot of people, find that moving forward off the back of being with someone who felt like their person, it's very hard to re-engage with life off the back of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, we could definitely talk more about that in detail. Before we completely jump in, I want you to talk a little bit more about what got you into letter reading versus one-on-one coaching, traditional one-on-one coaching, and also some of the other stuff that you've been working on. I know that you've also developed an AI program to help people in between sessions or in between their therapy appointments to give them extra support. So I'd love to talk about some of those other things that you've been working on as well.
Sure. I have mostly and still do one-on-one sessions. I'm trying to just veer away from them for a little bit. I got into reading people's stories of their dating experiences where I share my analysis, validation, and also constructive feedback where appropriate, because I wanted to do something fun that was outside of just one-on-one sessions. I also thought it would be really informative to explain to people, what was going on with cases that were very real and hot. And also, to my surprise, this is something that I realized as I kept doing it, was show just how common these experiences are. When we hear of statistics like, oh, narcissists are like 1 or 2% of the population diagnosed, it's really quite, I think, sobering to realize, oh crap, there's a huge population of people who are actually getting really, really bombarded and blindsided by these particular patterns of behavior that we see from this group of people. And I think that for me, what I love about letter readings is it's a very good way of creating psychoeducation and also sharing examples of what occurs in a way that you just wouldn't be able to do in a session. Sessions can have psychoeducation, but I think there's something really validating about having people listen in on a letter where the writer is anonymous, the partner is anonymous, and they can weigh in and they can be like, oh yeah, I resonate with this. Oh yes, I remember when I was like that and when I went through this. Oh, the memories, the PTSD. So, it sort of allowed me to have a educational, therapeutic, and entertaining segment to the work that I do, and I still really enjoy it. My team and I still do that. And I know you've been on a few, and yeah, I think it's been great. And also, from a slightly astrological perspective, as a Gemini, it sort of keeps me out of trouble from, talking about other people's business when they've written it out and it's all anonymous. So it's all, compliant with privacy and confidentiality. But in terms of the AI, yeah, I'm very sensitive to burnout, and I found that I wanted to find ways to be able to help people through what they're going through without necessarily still being the emotional container for it. And when I was introduced to GPT, I realized just how good it is in terms of being able to support people through a lot of stuff. And I think that, yes, it has significant limitations. Its sycophancy and its hallucinations are deeply problematic long term, but I could see its potential. And so I took a lot of my research on the case that I work on with avoidant discards, and also use that in creating a build of an AI to help people who are clients who just need something that they can turn to help them make sense of what they've been through. Because the trouble with a lot of this behavior is it's very confusing. And I think what ties the letter readings and the AI and my services together is really just demystifying and also explaining what the actual likely problems actually are. And also, I can't 100% guarantee and say this is exactly what it is. I think people turn to me because they feel like it's a best fit to explain what's going on. And at the very least, it gives them a sense of like, oh, this is a pattern of recognizable behavior. It makes sense. And I think it also helps people give them a sense of like, oh, it's not me. And it's not to say there's nothing to learn and reflect upon. There is much of the time. But I think it definitely takes away a lot of that self-blame that people are plagued by, where they think, I did all of these things and I lost the love of my life, where it's often like, no, I think in this context, a lot of that behavior you think you're responsible for is not in fact your fault. However, it would be naive to say that there aren't things to learn from. So generally, I think that's been my approach and why I've created products like this. And I do try and look for ways to, like I said, help people without overgiving.
Mm-hmm. What would you say would be some of the differences between your specific ChatGPT bot versus just the general ChatGPT bot? And also, too, how has it been received, you'd say?
Well, I think some of the key significant changes are, for those that are in the know, OpenAI has a data lake where it provides all the necessary information out to its models. So in other words, if you're using GPT, it's getting access to a data lake full of information which it draws upon. And it's also an open loop. So it means that if you or I are using GPT, what we put into it, the specifics may not necessarily go back to OpenAI, but enough of the material will be used as potential training for future models and iterations. So when we think of privacy and protection, it's not a good system for people who want to have their data protected, especially for people who are in a therapeutic space. Like that's one of the core, principles in terms of protecting clients. And the AI that's been built is different in that whilst it's disclosed that the data does ultimately go back to the developer themselves don't actually look at it. It's case sealed and put away. And what we've done is cut off the open loop. So it's only a one-way loop where users are getting information from the data lake. And I'll talk about some of the extras that differentiate it from GPT, where people who are accessing it, none of that information goes back to OpenAI. So the additional thing that separates it from just a GPT 2.0 is that a lot of the research that I've done with my clients, with the letters, the stories, the experiences, I'd amalgamated them and also just been able to look at common themes and patterns that I was then able to put into this bot that's been created, and we've called it Pi, and it exists on a platform called Kartra. So basically people can go onto it like they would with GPT and basically just put stuff in there. It doesn't have long-term memory, which has its pros and cons, but the significance of it is that it doesn't lead into significant hallucinations as a consequence. It does mean that people are able to get very accurate information about what they're navigating. And we really wanted to focus on giving the user more, not only privacy, but also more specifics about what they're engaging with that are relevant and relate to patterns that people have experienced. So one of the key frameworks that was developed was what's called the severe avoidant audit or severe avoidant assessment, which is designed to help you express, hey, I was with a partner who did all this sort of stuff. Here's this history, here's the timeline. And it basically assesses the case upon I think it's a 13-point scale where it basically says, okay, on a scale of like 0 to 5, your partner was like a 4 out of 5. They were pretty harmful. And there's another point, which is, there might also be some overlap of other things. It's not just the attachment style. There's some personality disturbances here. A question that a lot of people ask is, do they ever really love me? And Pi is really good at being able to basically say, well, in an essence, even if we can't definitively say this was quote unquote love, there's definitely demonstrations of emotion, investment, and care in this, but it's very segmented. It's very hot and cold with all the other behavior going on. So it doesn't sugarcoat it and saying, oh yes, your partner was absolutely 100% in love with you, nor does it say, get wrecked, they absolutely used you. It finds a nuanced middle ground based on the evidence to say, well, I think there's truth to this. There is definitely intensity in this dynamic. I think there's definitely someone who put a lot of emotion into this, but their fears got the better of them. And I think that's ultimately where you're at right now. And it's going to be like that until there's some meaningful intervention for this person. And overall, what we found with the feedback is that people are finding it exceedingly helpful in giving them meaning to a situation they've been through, in helping them calm them down if they're engaging with a person like this, because it helps them better understand what they're dealing with. And I think in real time, that's significant, because I think one of the biggest problems that people have in these trauma bonds is not just the intermittent reinforcement, the addiction of like hot and cold behavior. I think it's that people just don't understand why this is happening. I mean, if we think about it from just a conventional standpoint, a lot of this behavior doesn't make rational sense. Like, why would you break up with someone if you don't love? Why would you break up with someone if you claim to love them and they claim that they're your soulmate? That just seems bizarre unless you never really love them. But it's not as simple as that. And that's where having that education to be like, if we're dealing with a certain nervous system that equates love with threat, then no, love may have been an issue, but it's not the issue that you think it was, in the fact that there was never an absence of love that was the issue. In fact, that was often the catalyst for the relationship's breakdown. So yeah, overall, it's been exciting. It's been challenging, having to try and to work on this, but it's been a really good tool.
Yeah, no, it sounds like it's very helpful. I actually, you allowed me to trial it too, so I was able to firsthand give it a spin, and I thought it was very sophisticated. So I think that real-time feedback is extremely helpful for people that are going through this type of thing, because you can kind of burn out your close friends and family, especially if they don't really understand what you're going through. So it is so helpful to have an impersonal option to just, keep checking in with, or to hold you accountable. And I know there's pros and cons to AI. Maybe we could talk a little bit more about that. But what would you say would be the, how could AI be used in a helpful way? And why would coaching still be maybe helpful on top of that?
I think where, AI is phenomenal is if you give it certain facts and also try and keep the emotion out of it. Like if you just explain the story as it is, it's very good at picking up patterns and being able to connect those with known models of behavior. Where I think the human interaction is still extremely important is that AI tends to get a little bit excited. It starts to think, yes, it could absolutely be this. It could absolutely be a case that your ex was actually related to a previous ex and is also somehow connected to a family. It's just like, no, calm the hell down. It's not that. It's probably not that. sometimes GPT models, they can be good at giving you a sobering fact check. And if you're constantly prompting them, like, give me the facts, then it can do its best to try and tell you things plainly. The problem is it's also trying to like you and get you to like it. And whereas I think with counseling, if I'm being brutally honest, and I wonder if you feel this way, well, yes, we're meant to have a positive regard, but that doesn't mean I need to like you. Like, it's one of those things where I'm not interested in if you like me or not, in the sense of I'm trying to win your approval. And that objectivity means I also pick up on signals that AI just simply would. Like, I mean, I'm able to pick up on signals and signs and go, hey, I'm feeling this. But feeling something intuitively is very different from someone being like, oh, well, I feel like they're about to break up with me, which sounds more like a panic sort of response. And AI might go, oh, yes, that's very understandable. And, that might be coming from XYZ or ABC. But I think to a dysregulated nervous system, it's all just noise. It's all just something like, oh, yeah, well, that's what my intuition tells me. Therefore, I'm going to do it. And so I think the problem with AI and users is if a user is dysregulated, then the AI is going to give dysregulated responses, or there's going to be confirmation bias. And I think also, even though AI has a lot of strengths, I think that, and yes, we understand humans are still flawed as well too. I think if you've got someone who's a clinician who really is relatively grounded and also has gone through their own experiences and is able to just pick up stuff and go, hey, I'm feeling this, can I point this back to you? That kind of feedback in real time with another human being, I still think is significant. In fact, I was chatting with a colleague of mine today. We were saying, we actually deleted our GPTs off our phones because we were finding that for us, we need to still have authorship and authority over our life and our well-being. And we found like we were starting to outsource too much of our brains to GPT. Like, no, we need to like create some separation here. It doesn't mean to say that it's not helpful for people who need to at least have some education when they're going through a difficult situation. But I think it's about knowing that balance when it's like it's taking over your authority and when it's also helping you to navigate something that you just don't understand.
Sure, yeah. No, I can definitely see that becoming a problem. And I think we'll probably see widespread effects of that pretty soon here, where people do outsource the majority of their thinking to AI just because it is so convenient. And the answers are very sophisticated. I mean, I use ChatGPT pretty regularly as of now, and I definitely see the temptation to just be like, all right, do my thinking for me, because I feel stressed out and I don't want to actually process these painful emotions myself. Or at least like the thinking, right? So yeah, so I definitely see what you're saying for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like it's really good for assembling thoughts together and also being able to do some research in terms of collating information. At the end of the day, if you use it as a replacement for your own critical thinking skills, you've got a problem.
Right, for sure. I think that's that line in the sand where it's going to start to become dysfunctional and unhelpful in the long term. There's a couple different things that we could talk about. One of those things would be your AI model does, to a degree, and correct me if I'm wrong, personality profiling or avoidant profiling. So there's different kind of flavors of avoidance, and I think that's where there's a lot of interesting juice on the fruit here that we can explore. Just like archetypes would be another way to kind of put it almost.
Yes. Do you want me to go into detail about some of those archetypes?
I'm ready for it.
Well, I guess I can give a really good example of one that I've been playing around with, which I talked to you about recently, was this idea of what I call the high-functioning avoidant who is structurally dissociated, and that's a lot of words. And so to break it down, if I had to build an avoidant attacher who's like this, I first want to disclaimer and say, not every avoidant attacher is like this. There's lovely avoidants out there. I know I'm sounding cynical, but it's just because I'm feeling crusty today. So let's get straight into it. Basically, when it comes to this kind of individual, we're looking at someone who is boy, girl, who has a lot of charm. They probably have a lot of friends. There's someone who probably doesn't really know those friends very deeply. This is an individual who, is committed to their job and, they seem kind of large and in charge, and they're very cool. Like, you sort of look at them and think, oh my God, like they're the life of the party. They're so like magnetizing. And these individuals tend to be people who have a very sort of like dreamy sort of outlook to them. And I don't mean just in appearance. I mean like they actually have a bit of a daydreamy aspect to them. Like they're very sort of like lost in thought. They might fixate on something like the grass and talk about how green it is. And they're not necessarily high, although that can be a feature. That leads me to, they also have a tendency to be highly stimulant dependent. So not only things to like coffee, but they also tend to have a lot of addictions as well too, because they need to have like a fantasy. You know, these are the kind of individuals where they really are very absorbed in their own little world. And, you know, even human interactions and relationships, you know, I think enter through the filter of a dream and a bit of fantasy. So if you're dating someone like this and they get really excited by you, it's this almost like innocence and this, you know, wild curiosity that goes to 110%, where they're like, oh my God, wow, I've never met someone like you before. You're so cool. And of course, you really feel it because this person is like really into you. And what's interesting is as you get to know them, you realize that a lot of that large and in chargeness about them is very much based on how they want to look, how they want to present themselves, but they're really hiding a big, big shame wound where they have a deep desire to run away from a very young and what they would probably view as a very weak version of themselves. Like they have such a desire to avoid who they are deep inside. And so when they're with individuals, yes, they have a lot of the avoidant flavor of hot and coldness in terms of like if there's too much intimacy, it causes them to back away because it's like too much. But there's a deeper feature to it. The feature is that they don't want to be known by their partner. They don't want to be vulnerable. What we talk about capacity issues with avoidance, I think in this archetype is more about collapse. It's that thing of if you see me, you really get to know me, you will hate me, and I have to get rid of you because being reminded of myself is awful. And I think this is what characterizes the avoidant discard, is that it's not just so much like a banishment of the partner, it's that also they just don't want to reconnect with themselves. They don't want that. And any time that, you know, intimacy gets closer, of course you're going to get to know a partner more for who they are, and they don't want that. We see these people tend to also be very alexithymic. They're not very connected with their emotions. They tend to be very bad at recognizing emotional harm that they do at other people as well too. Like they might refer to how, I'll give you an example. They might be like, oh, I'm just sharing this story about how I took a ex of mine to a play, and just so happened that a former ex was also in the play and they were naked during the entire production. And I thought it was a bit awkward that I had to introduce both exes to each other. It's played off as a joke when it's like, no, that's actually kind of, you know, like, can you not see how wrong that would be to either of those parties? And why are you also still hanging out with your ex in this capacity? I haven't got any hard or fast rules about staying friends with exes. I think that's to each their own. But when it's done in a way where it's like, oh, you don't want to have proper closure, you still want to have people, oh, this is a key feature. You want your partners to regulate you because you don't feel good about yourself. You know, we're really getting into a place where you're starting to use people. But before people jump in and say, well, they're a narcissist, I'd say this is where this archetype sort of sits. It's more than just someone who's avoidant. It's someone who's not narcissistic enough to be a narcissist. They definitely engage in narcissistic supply. They want validation. They want regulation. But do they have the hallmark characteristics of grandiosity, of needing to have like excessive isolation and control of a partner? Not necessarily. And also, even though they have a lot of shifting emotions, it's almost like not BPD enough in terms of their mood dysregulation to be borderline personality disorder across all cases. So that's just one example of this. And I mean, you can see this everywhere. Like there's like so many actors who could do this. And these people are, I've got to be honest, very good at acting in the context that I think who they present themselves to be is, like I said, who they'd like to be seen as, but it's not really a reflection of who they truly are deep inside of themselves.
So this type of personality that you're describing, would this be more of, if we're looking at the broad categories of attachment, would this be more of a dismissive avoidant or more of a fearful avoidant, or both, you think?
I think it sort of sits in between. It's sort of someone who I would describe as like more often than not a dismissive leaning fearful avoidant. And these are some of the most common presentations of harm I have heard across my letter readings. Like,
Mm,
it's insane how striking they are across men and women.
right. Yeah, no, for sure. I definitely can tap into the personality that you're describing for sure, as far as what that looks like. And I do believe it's very prevalent. I know, like in the official statistical literature, fearful avoidance, they're technically the smallest category of avoidant if we're looking at things in like a broad sense. But it's interesting because I think it's very prevalent. Like classic dismissive avoidance, I personally don't come across that often. Now that could be like obviously a selection bias, or, but I just don't tend to see it as much.
No, dismissive avoidance, in my experience, like I genuinely believe that's a capacity issue for the most part. And I think with dismissive avoidance, in my experience, I find like that's almost like, if you will, the old guard of people. Like I feel like that was like the James Bonds of the 60s and the 90s. That's like, it's like they're all fossils now. It's like they don't exist. They do exist, but I feel like that flavor, that personality is a rare find compared to what we're talking about.
Right. Yeah, really the only time that I'll see it in like its classic form is if I have a client that is like a blue collar guy, for example, and he was raised to not show much emotion and to be stoic, and he looks at emotions or even therapy as kind of like unnecessary or silly. I'll get some of that from time to time, but again, what I tend to see more often is, like you described, the dismissive leaning fearful avoidant, or just more of a classic fearful avoidant, where there's a lot of that hot cold, and there is that anxiety feature where you can actually kind of see it play out more.
Oh, 100%. Like I'm even thinking off the top of my head now, like I've known some people in my life who are definitely, on the DA spectrum. And if I had to characterize one, for instance, if I again had to build one, I'd say engineer, very cerebral, like mega cerebral. I think he looks at relationships like a puzzle, not necessarily as like, there's also some ephemeral stuff here too that you got to think about. And I think he kind of overcomplicates things. And, I love him to pieces, but it's just one of those things where it's like, he can't quite wrap his head around the emotional side of things. And I want to make it very clear in this build-a-bear sort of situation, I'm not saying, neurodivergence can't play a picture in this, but for the sake of the attachment presentation, I'm not going to go. I think it's more just to say, this is someone who I think can be very thoughtful, active, servicey, but they may not, but they may be very low emotional affect, and they may not really think about like the emotional stuff because they're not really connected with it. But I think the thing I find with these individuals is still very sensitive, but they're not so, I feel like they don't have that flighty, panicky energy. Like if they break up with you, they're not crying about it going, oh, I made a mistake 2 days later. They're very much like, no, I think this is for the best. And so like they just sort of go off and do their own thing.
You're saying a classic dismissive avoidant, or like the dismissive avoidant leaning?
The former, dismissive avoidant. Like I feel like classic dismissive avoidants are very much like one and done. They're not like sort of like circling back. But I think if that circling back behavior occurs, it's not to say that it can't happen, but it's just to say that's a little bit unusual.
Sure, sure. Another place where we can pivot to, which we can spend a lot of time on, would be like coming up with terminology that's helpful for people. And again, that lends itself to these different like flavors of avoidance or these personality profiles. So I think building a vocabulary that people can, relate to, and they can kind of contextualize their experience is super helpful. And that's where I think attachment theory is going to get much more specific and more categorical as time goes on, which I think would be helpful. Now, at the same time, too, people can get too buried in like the clinical terminology, and they can hide behind it, or they can like leverage it, for ill intentions. So I know there's like a drawback to it as well, but that's kind of where I see things potentially going. And I feel like you're kind of doing that a little bit already.
In terms of like labels and diagnoses.
Right. And then trying to build a more comprehensive framework that people can look at and be like, oh, okay, it's this type of person, because I mean, you can gain that experience just by dating and putting yourself out there, and intuitively you'll start to kind of categorize different types of people. But if there's more of like a taxonomy where you can just turn to and be like, oh, interesting, like this is psychoeducational, I think that is helpful for people.
Oh, 100%. But I mean, I think a lot of people already do that as well too. Like, I mean, not to sound cray about it, but like, I mean, to me, it's like the Pokemon of dating. Like, you just sort of get used to like the little flavors of this, little flavors of that, and you're like, yeah, it's of this type. And I think for me, what I like about the attachment styles is the fact that we acknowledge it's a spectrum, but it's not a diagnosis, which is great because you can use that language a bit liberally. I think the danger is that if we subscribe to the whole thing of like, well, avoidance are the devil, therefore we just avoid the avoidance, I don't think that's a healthy framework to have by any stretch of the imagination. I think that's where the critical thinking then goes by the wayside. And I think what's more practical is people to be like, okay, I'm noticing this sort of behavior and it's starting to fall into this sort of pattern. And ultimately over time, people will get to a point in my experience where they won't even need that. They're just like this behavior is happening. I don't have to put up with it. And so that's where I think that helps people to just trust their intuition more and be like, I don't need to engage if this is going to be the way that it is. I just don't feel like this is appropriate. I think also, when we consider, I think a lot of this stuff, it's really good, I think, having this psychoeducation though, because what it will give you though is a really good understanding into yourself. If you understand a lot of your own stuff and also can see it in other people, it does mean you have a better discernment for partner selection and also for what you would argue is agreeable behavior.
Sure. One concept that I've been thinking a lot about, especially recently, is the concept of attunement. And I know that word can kind of be used liberally or loosely, but I think it's super helpful to be able to tune into what attunement looks like, how to give it to other people, and how to observe if someone is giving it to you. Because that's one of those things that I've noticed where you can't like communicate around that. Like, I'm not saying people can't expand their repertoire of attunement and being empathetic and communicating, but capacity, use the word capacity earlier. I think that's huge when it comes to someone's ability to attune to someone else's needs and wants. And avoidants are notoriously bad at that because they don't tune into their own emotions. And what you tend to notice is that things that should be obvious to you, like, oh, they should have just reached out because this was going on, and you're like, are you a quote unquote regular person would do that? There are going to be those gaps that you notice. So have you noticed that yourself?
Between people, yes. I think we actually spoke about this a while ago where we were talking about commitment as like an example of this. Like, I think for me, whenever I hear language like, oh, again, I can give examples of this. Like, if someone said, hey, what's your favorite book? And the person said something like, well, I have so many, but I don't want to just say like, what's my favorite? Because what if I change my mind? To me, hearing that response, I'm sort of like, what? Like, I mean, I have favorites that come and go. Like, it's not a big deal. But for these people, there are very psychologically sophisticated reasons as to why it is a big deal. And that's where I really find it fascinating. But in a dating context, you've got to pay attention to that sort of stuff because, it's not to say disqualify the person because I can't pick a favorite book, but it's just to say, that's what I would call it's what I call a potential clue. If you then ask them something like, okay, well, I'm just kind of curious, what are you looking for? And they say something like, oh, I just want to go with the flow. You're sort of starting to pick a picture out that this is someone who's, avoiding commitment. And when it comes to that fear of commitment, a lot of that is very sensible for these people because even though it may not be sensible to us, these individuals have usually, for the most part, lost touch with their identity. They've lost touch, or they've also been smothered or enmeshed or had so much neglect that they had to shut that part of them that connects down to protect themselves. So, it may be a bit like chatting with an alien in the sense that it's different, it's foreign, it's not what I'd normally think about. And this is where we really need to challenge that concept of normal because ultimately we are wired with differences. And I think, but at the same time, and I suspect this is why the Myers-Briggs took off, is there are still, I think, there's merit to this idea of archetypes because I think that there are particular flavors of things that are quite similar across people.
For sure. What are your thoughts on, let's say, anxious people getting with avoidant people? Because you mentioned it's like, all right, if someone is avoidantly attached, it doesn't necessarily mean you just write them off just because categorically that's where they fall. Because if you were to do that, that would be pretty black and white, and you would potentially rule out a lot of good people. But there is also that discernment where it's like, all right, yeah, I know this is just not going to go well because I've seen this movie so many times. So I guess what would be your thoughts on that and like how to figure that out?
Yeah, good question. I think that with regards to discernment, if you're someone who's going into dating, and I know you and I both sort of occupy team anxiously attached in recovery. For me, the minute I sense avoidant attachment, I don't freak out and think abort the date and let them pay the bill. I'm usually just thinking, okay, that's data. And if they explicitly say I'm avoidantly attached, I'm like, oh, nice. This is like, okay, thanks for telling me that. Good information to know. For me, I think what's really useful information is just, okay, let's just see how things go. I'll be myself. I'll just see what happens. I'll just see how we interact, particularly between dates, and just see how, things proceed from there. And, one thing usually happens after another, and it's pretty quick to see whether or not this thing's got legs or not. But I think this is where it's really important to stay, again, discerning, I think grounded, regulated. And also if you find like any big emotions come up, which usually they do, like those panicky feelings of like, oh my God, like, am I, are they going like, when are they going to get back to me? Do they want to break up with me? I think you have a bit of a recognition that's like, that's okay, that's our stuff. And it may be triggered by their distance, and that's one thing. But I think also, finding a way to stay calm in a storm that wants to just just to break up or run away is it's a skill that you learn over time. I just think that when it comes to dating people who are avoidantly attached, if you are anxiously attached, you really need to be mindful of the signals you pick up, because at the end of the day, yes, this person can cut and run, but I think also there's a really important skill to learn, which is, allowing things to just come to their natural conclusion. And if you don't try and force something to work, it'll go to where it wants to go.
Right. Just naturally, the momentum is going to take it in a direction. I think what makes it hard with the anxious avoidant pairing is just, it's so easy to polarize each other in the wrong direction, because you have someone that's leaning a little bit in this direction that hurts this person. Then you have this person that's leaning a little bit in this direction that hurts the other person. So you kind of have already a perfect storm where for the anxious person, you have to focus extremely hard on that regulation almost the entire time. And that's where I think, to a degree, it's like, is this even worth it? You have to ask yourself that personal question. But to get to that point, it also requires you some trial and error to actually feel things out and to see where they're at.
You nailed that so well. And this is where I think, for instance, on dating profiles, there are usually common tells, which for me, I'm just like, yeah, that's a no. For example, like when I'm dating people, I'm on like online. If I see someone with a handle, like where they're on Hinge, for instance, pointing me in the direction of an Instagram account, and they also have, what I'd say, provocative photos, for me, that's a no. Because I feel like, okay, we're shifting this into a different environment where it's under your control. And that, again, is something that I would normally see, again, with these, as I used the archetype before, those high-functioning avoidants who are structurally dissociated, because that's usually a bit of their pipeline for stuff as well. And that's fine. They're allowed to do what they want to do. But having played that game, I know the rules, and I'm just like, yeah, no thanks. And so I think there's that level of discernment. But I think also when you're taking a chance on some people and you're trying some things out, you just learn things along the way where you're like, okay, I recognize this. To your point, I know one of the big things that I've navigated, and this is a big topic that I'd love to talk about one day, is I know for me, if I'm engaging with someone, and this can even be a friend, where I feel like there's a lot of intensity that I'm feeling from the other person, and they are telling me, oh, just a friend, that signaling is so ambiguous. And for me, I'm just like, no, I don't want this. Because the cost of regulating that every time I see a person like this, it's too much. So if we put this into a dating context, if you feel like you have to regulate yourself just to keep the relationship going, like 90% of the time, there's a problem.
Right, for sure. I want to maybe touch on structural dissociation. If you can maybe talk more about that and kind of break it down into simple terms, that could be helpful. But yeah, and also too, so going back to the intensity portion, I think for avoidantly attached people, a lot of them, they confuse intensity and passion with intimacy.
Yes, I do.
You know, and they try to use it as a substitute when it's not a sustainable substitute. And I think that's where it gets super tricky, because yes, you can regulate yourself if you're anxious leaning, and you can focus on your side of the road, so to speak. But the really confusing part, and the part that makes it hard to stay in the pocket, is the fact that avoidance will, like, if you distance, they actually will a lot of times, especially if they're fearful avoidant, they'll try to get you back on the hook. So
Yes,
that's where you're like, okay, I don't know, you're pulling me in two different directions. And I describe it as like, it's like emotional parkour, you know, that's one way I describe it. You're like, I don't even know, I'm like juking and jiving.
Yes, and often we don't have insurance for that, because often the damage can be quite bad if we jump and fall flat on our face, emotionally speaking. So yeah, you're right. Well, I think to go back to the original question, what is structural dissociation? In a nutshell, it's basically where you are someone who engages in a fantasy version of reality much of the time in order to get, I want to say like dopamine, but that is part of it, but just basically to get away from the distress of being you. So to kind of give you an example of this, and this sort of connects to a lot of like trauma terms, so I'm going to try and simplify this for the lay person. You could be someone who is looking for the high in things, like the release of things, as a way of feeling better about yourself. So this could be from the heights of sex to the heights of, say, catching a really cool wave in surfing, you know, drug use, work, you know, like sales. This is someone, and also when you're in dissociation, you're not really connecting with your core self, because you're in a state where you're functioning in a land of make-believe and a land of pretend as well too. And to link this to trauma terms, it's often combined, it's combined with both fawn and freeze, which are some of the more severe terms in terms of like fight, flight, freeze, fawn. These people are often in such a state of like perpetual high functioning freeze, which means, you know, they show up, they look like they're quite capable, but it's the way they present themselves, and it's done to, you know, help them elicit good reactions from people in order to feel better about themselves. So when we refer to it as structured, the idea is they can't live without it. Like if they go without, they will collapse. And I've seen this happen, and I wonder if you have too. Like I've worked with some clients who have structural dissociation, and it's for a very good reason. Because if they connect with who they are, they will collapse, and it is not pretty. Like they often feel a lot of shame. I remember there was a client I had ages ago where I took inner child work, you know, where say the average person could maybe handle inner child work because they don't have that need for structural dissociation. If someone's like that and they do inner child work, it can cause them serious issues. So that's why when we look at this as a framework, it's to show like, no, this person needs fantasy at all costs. And, you know, a cost to the illusion of fantasy breaking is if things go into reality. Like I remember an ex of mine, they were like, the minute that the relationship got real, that was it, game over.
And why do you feel like that was? Again, like using this framework of structural dissociation.
For them, navigating a relationship, like for him, it was navigating a candy store. Like for me in our dynamic too, I remember, and this was like years ago before I had the dating experience I have now, you know, I would ask him, hey, what are you looking for in a relationship after we've done all these relationship things? And it was just this jovial, oh, I haven't really thought about that. And, you know, his answers for what he was looking for, if he really thought about it, were kind of like superficial and trivial. Like, oh, I just want someone who just has their head screwed on. It's like, don't we all? You know, it was like he wanted to extract the highs of a relationship without actually having to live in a relationship.
That makes a lot of sense. And again, going back to the concept of attunement, attunement is that kind of happy medium and that really useful skill. We could even call it the core relational skill that sits with a secure person in their nervous system. And so what you're describing, the structural dissociation, where a severe avoidant or someone severely traumatized has to live with this fantasy lens, that's going to be a barrier to true attunement because they're not actually connected to their actual core emotions because of the trauma. So it's impossible to be attuned to their partner because they can't dip into that ability to empathize, at least not on a deep level.
You're absolutely right. And, you know, why would they, and like if that version of themselves that's able to connect with pain, you know, is buried deep down, how the hell are they supposed to connect with what you're going through as well too? It's all viewed on the lens of like, well, that doesn't bother me, so why does it bother you?
And it's not bothering them because they're actually not tapping into their feelings because they have the dissociation.
Yes, exactly. And when you are in dissociation, you are fundamentally separated from who you are as a person. And that can be quite severe. That's why often that presentation can look sometimes schizoid or even schizophrenic without the entities.
Mm-hmm. Or narcissistic as well. You know, they're putting up a persona.
Yes, you nailed it. Exactly right. And I think, though, what's interesting is it's sort of like, I don't know, like, I wonder if this sort of feels right for you. It sort of feels like balloon people. It's almost like they, like I said, they sort of appear larger than life, but easily pinned, and then they just deflate.
That's a good analogy for sure. Yep. When things get real, again, that's going to be the trigger. And I have definitely seen that structural dissociation in sessions. And I heard the term like when I was in grad school, but it didn't really click. Like I didn't have like reference experiences to have it make sense. It just sounded super fancy and trauma-ish. But as you know, I became more trauma informed, unfortunately, largely through my own personal experiences, which is one way to do it. In session, I can see, especially when I'm doing EMDR, I'll see the moment where they dissociate and they shut off. And I'll even ask them and they're like, yeah, you know, it was too intense. I shut off. I'm like, all right. So then you see that play out in relationships. It's just the average person doesn't have that clinical lens to be able to perceive what's happening through.
Well, in that context, it's like, where did you go? What happened? Can I get you back again? And it's like, no, that person's gone. It's like they're not coming back. It's for their, you know, when we think of, I was actually thinking about this the other day, like, you know, when we think of the world at large, yes, we're becoming more attuned, emotionally available, mature, but at the same time, many of us are not. We're still rooted in survival. And, you know, there's this concept of like psychic survival, which is if the psyche, you know, basically how we view ourselves and the world around us, if like our core concept of self is about to be exterminated, then yeah, you know, we're going to do things out of survival. So it's almost actually a great way to think about it is, you know, if we think of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you know, we think of shelter, food, water, money. I mean, for these people, they're in that sort of perpetual state of like their psychology poor, like they're resource poor, like they have to rely on their survival skills just to function in society. So those sort of like upper echelons of like connectedness, self-actualization, that ain't happening.
Sure. And this is why I tell people that behavior is a gold standard. Words are like silver. It's still a precious metal, but you don't want to make it the number one because exactly what we're describing from that clinical lens, if someone is engaging that structural dissociation, which is going to be unconscious, they don't know they're doing it most of the time. Otherwise, they'd be more secure because they'd work on it. That's what's going to make it, again, impossible to fully connect with them. And you'll see those gaps. You'll see those little drop-offs. And then if you try to communicate around it, they only have so much capacity to do so. And communication doesn't change capacity.
No, and this is why I say I actually think it's more of a collapse issue rather than a capacity issue, because I think it's one thing to be afraid of intimacy as it draws nearer and to like do the whole hot and cold dance. But I think there's that extra element, which is if you get close and you get to know this person, that's going to be game over very quickly.
Sure. And I also think too, now that psychological terms have been more mainstream and therapy has become more mainstream, people have more of that vocabulary that they'll utilize in an everyday sense. But that can be misleading because, you know, someone might be like, yeah, you know, I go to therapy and I understand, you know, the attachment theory, generally speaking. I know there's the anxious attachers, the avoidant attachers. I think I lean towards, you know, avoidant attachment. They'll be able to tell you all of this. But if they, again, are experiencing that structural dissociation, if we're going to continue to use that term, they can tell you whatever they want. It's not going to change their behavioral patterns.
No, and I mean, that's the thing is that like with structural dissociation, if it's serving a purpose, it will be about, okay, well, you know, how do I need to present in order to get my needs met? And those needs may very well be extraction, you know, getting emotional, you know, regulation in, because if you think about it, right, they need the other person to regulate themselves because they don't have the means to do it themselves. So hence why people feel used. They feel like it's almost like this drainage that occurs and they feel like, oh God, you're like a vampire. It's like, well, no, these people aren't intentionally vampiric. They do this because they've got no means to actually comfort themselves. And this can play out in one of two ways. It's either like that, you know, large and in charge, like I need to have like all the crowd of people. Or it could also be the other way where it appears more like I'm a terrible person, I'm a shit, I'm a this, I'm a that, woe, pity me. And again, both presentations can look narcissistic, covert, or grandiose, and yet I don't think it just quite makes the cut to be like American Psycho level. I mean, that's a whole other kind of category in itself.
Yeah, and it can be hard to distinguish between narcissism and avoidant attachment. And you can beat that. Whatever the saying? Beat the horn dead, or what? I don't remember what it is. You can go back and forth about that debate, but I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, or if you have additional input to this, but to me, it's like a true narcissist. They need that ego supply so that way they can preserve the ego itself. Whereas a severe avoidant, it's more that structural dissociation to get their needs met and to alleviate anxiety. Those are two like different processes, even though externally it can look very similar.
And I also think too, there's like large elements of emotional arrested development as well too. Like it feels childlike, and that's why I think the excitement they have for partners feels genuine. I don't think it's that. Yes, there's so many parallels to this. Like we could say, well, they're looking for regulation, but also that falls under the category of narcissistic supply. They, have this need for structural dissociation to avoid themselves, but so do narcissists. Like, oh, they're the same. And I'm like, well, and this is where when the rubber hits the road and you've had that real life experience, it's so different. Like, I mean, a narcissist needs to put you down and have a way. And I mean, people might say, well, avoidants do that too. It's like, no. Like, if an avoidant attacher is using you as like a means to not only, like, if we look at it in the context of they're taking out some of their unpleasant material on you, like they're, particularly if they've been enmeshed, and I'm thinking of like avoidant men in this context, like severe avoidant men. If they're treating a woman they're with and punishing her like a mother, then yeah, that's, that is projection, and it's also going to feel punishing and it's going to feel narcissistic for sure. But usually it stays in the like that relationship. It doesn't sort of leak out across other dimensions as well too. Whereas with narcissists, that narcissism is something that we'll often usually see across the board with a lot of other things. There was actually an episode I did of the podcast for letter readings where it was so clear night and day what the difference was. There was a letter where I read out this person who I would absolutely, I'd stake my life. I'd die on a hill and say that was a narcissist, because when they were humiliated, they made everyone know about it. When an avoidance humiliated, they might collapse and shut down, but they're not, punishing the world for it off the back of it, in my experience.
Yeah, I'd agree with that too. Severe avoidant attachment is more contained. It's contained to that intimate relationship. It's not usually like a severe general strategy where they look narcissistic. And I think too, it's like, again, that severe avoidant, they'll use you as a grounding post, let's say, so that way they feel more stable while, they get companionship, but they're not in actual intimacy because, again, you're the grounding post. You're not the true partner that they're interfacing with. Where if you're with a true narcissist, it feels like they're trying to take your soul, like
Yes.
they're really trying to just burn you to the ground. And that's not the same thing. I don't want to diminish someone's experience with a severe avoidant, but those are two very distinct experiences.
Yes, I think it's one of those things where you recognize, it's more than just hating on you because of insecurities. I think there's a dimension to it that survivors know where, like, I can speak for myself and say, as someone who's grown up with avoiding parents who have narcissistic tendencies, I remember when I would say that, like, I could tell I threatened my dad's ego, but do I think that he was someone who was overtly narcissistic in all of his relationships? Absolutely not. I think that it was very contained to our relationship, and I think being a child to a parent, that already comes with degrees of closeness and intimacy that you wouldn't have if you were a friend or an acquaintance or a coworker. Whereas when I've heard stories of narcissistic parents, it's almost like you're playing chess and you are the chess piece, and you're either going to be the pawn or the knight in their army.
It's a good parallel as well. Let's maybe kind of start to wrap it up. I do want to hit some other salient points that would be helpful for people though. What would be, I guess, just general advice for someone that was recently discarded? What would you tell them? What's kind of like that first aid or emotional triage? Because I mean, I continue to see people that are in those situations, whether it's clinically or through my coaching practice. And I also see a lot of survivors of narcissism too recently. But yeah, what would be some of your just general advice and first line practices?
If they wanted to, they would.
That's a good one.
In all seriousness, though, generally it's demystifying that point to begin with, because that's a big one that people are plagued by. I think what I would firstly say is, look, your experience matters. They probably did care about you, but you have to understand that the care and the intensity was probably the thing that brought it to its end. And there's not really anything you can do to solve this, because this person, the way they're wired, the way they're structured, it's not conducive to a healthy long-term relationship. And I'm obviously simplifying for the sake of time, but I think what people really need to hear is, let's break it down bit by bit. Let's go through your story. Let's understand what you've been through. Let's also talk about, an interpretation of this. Does it feel real to you? Does it feel right based on your lived experiences? And go from there. I think what's dangerous for survivors is when they're invalidated and when they're told crap, like if they wanted to, they would, or they're just not that into you, because it's not always that. I think particularly with the severe avoidant cases, it's almost invariably not the case. I think that, that might be a situation in some stories, but when we're dealing, and it's not to say that all avoidants discard because they're scared of love. It's not. It's more just that those signs and hallmarks are usually categorically, like, there's enough stuff there to be like, oh yeah, like we can see what's going on here just because of the patterns that are showing up. So I think if you're with a clinician who really can, I mean, my team does this, and so does Cody. I think if you're with a clinician who really understands like the the crime scene well, they'll be able to tell you why the murder happened in the first place.
What about someone who's maybe on the fence about coaching or therapy, and they're experiencing these setbacks in dating, and maybe they did get discarded or they're going through a breakup? But they're like, but what's talking about it going to do? I mean, I could talk to a friend about it.
Well, firstly, your friend probably doesn't know what they're talking about, and secondly, we're experts, so trust us. No, I'm joking. Sort of. I think that the problem with talking to friends about it is friends often. Okay, there's a few reasons for this. I'm going to try and be succinct. Friends often don't have the critical insight that you might have. Now, if they do understand the terminology and they get it, fantastic. That's a resource. But you may find that, and they also may too, feel increasingly burnt out listening to this material. We as clinicians and coaches are paid to listen to this. In fact, it's so interesting because I will still say, like, even though the stories all follow a very similar pattern, I still find myself fascinated by it because, again, it goes back to that Pokemon thing. It's like, wow, this is a little bit different from the last one. There's some nuance with this. This is really cool. Holy crap, like, it just goes to show how similar some people are. Like, that's exciting. Like, I find that stuff really kind of, is what brings me back into this. And I think too, it'd be like if you had a health issue. You can talk to your mum and your friends about the skin issues you're having, but it's one thing to cover it up with moisturizers and makeup. It's another thing entirely to get to the root cause, to understand, well, the dandruff you're experiencing may in fact actually be caused by malassezia, which is a yeast in your scalp. And that also may connect with a whole bunch of other issues that you may not be aware of that you should actually think about, because it could also impact your long-term well-being and survival. So, that it's level of insight and depth and capacity.
That makes sense to me. Well, what about any additional things that maybe you wanted to dip into or that come to mind? And if not, you could definitely plug your stuff and let people know how to find you.
I basically think that everyone we've talked about, those with a structured dissociation, are all people who've been born with Aquarius in their chart. So just avoid them and that will solve all your problems. They're the ones who are the big thinkers anyways. But in all seriousness though, if you want to find me, you can check me out on kenreed.co on Instagram or TikTok. I'm also on YouTube as well too. I'm the same name. And if you would like to submit a letter for us to review, by all means, go ahead. We love reviewing people's letters and hearing them out. And if you would like to also check out the AI, that is being released again in February this year. So yeah, lots of exciting stuff happening.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you coming on the podcast. I'll definitely have you on again. And I know we talk regularly, so this isn't, a big deal to us regardless, but it's cool that people can find your stuff, maybe that they haven't found you already. And then if anyone wants to check out my stuff, Cody Weldon, LCSW is my Instagram handle, or you can go to my website, codyweldon.com. So appreciate you coming on.
No, thank you very much for having me.